And we're live.
We are live.
Very live.
We're live and live. Bambos, we have a special guest today.
Yes, we do.
Yes, every so often we like to invite accomplished people on the show, just so we can reflect on what we still haven't achieved in our own lives.
Exactly.
In this show, we've got Russell Shorto. He is an author, and when we say an author, I mean he really is an author. Like when he's what I compare myself to when I say I can't call myself an author. So, when I look at his work, I look at his dedication to his craft. I look at the back of any of his books have an index of all of his sources. You know, there's only like one source that I have for my books is like a bad memory. So, I mean, there's a drastic difference in how I categorize it. So we've got Russell Shorto on the hour for, or what am I saying? What is the show called, Bambos?
A Wonderful Chaos.
Thank you. Yes, Bambos. So I came into contact with Russell through a friend, a mutual friend, Jan Six, who we also had on the show. And Jan and Russell have had contact throughout the years. And he was also in the book that I am so happy to have read. And it taught me so much about Amsterdam, this book here, for those. If anyone lives in the Netherlands, or if you're visiting Amsterdam, then this is a must read. And it's a must read, not because I'm trying to pilfer off a book or anything, Bambos.
I get that.
But because it taught me things that I didn't understand after having lived here for 10 years. It was finally like, oh, that now it makes sense. It was like watching the Sixth Sense. And at the end of the movie, you realize that he's a ghost. Like, this was the ghost moment for me. Like, wow, that's what's going on here.
You actually gave me this book when I started my business and I was doing photo shoot tours.
Okay.
And I wanted to learn more about Amsterdam. And that was one of the things that you suggested. Actually, another friend also who's a lawyer, he said, you need to read this book.
Yeah.
So I took parts of that book and I would use it during the tours.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And, I actually did a quick search on Russell before I came here, and I saw like he's the headliner on the red light district tour of what you need to read before you come here. So he might not know that, but they're actually pumping his book in every corner of Amsterdam.
Nice.
And so for that reason, I was so excited when Jan says to me, I know the guy who wrote that book. And I said, you know Russell? Because I mean, he's been called Russell in the house, even though we haven't known each other. And I said, well, you have to bring him over. And then we had him over at the building, gave him a quick tour. And then he was one of the first people I thought we got to have on the show.
Beautiful.
So
show 82.
Yeah, show 82.
Shall we bring him on?
We bring him on. Russell. Hello.
Hi, guys. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you for coming on.
Really?
Yeah, show 82. 82 since the start of COVID.
Wow. What do you do, like one a day or something?
One a day. I know you didn't think you were going to be a commodity, but you were just one of the many, Russell. Sorry.
You're madmen. You do 82 in a row?
82 in a row.
Beginning of April, right?
Beginning of April. Basically, I just looked and said, if I'm going to be indoors, then I'm going to find the most interesting, curious people and subjects. And 1 hour a day, I'm going to explore something new and interesting. And we've had some really interesting, and we sort of came halfway to getting Jane Elliott on from the blue eye brown eye experiment, but somehow a storm came in over Omaha and her Wi-Fi went out. Wow. So we've been pretty serious about this. Yeah.
And you are still in Amsterdam, obviously. I can tell by the map behind you.
In the same building. Yeah, we always have the green screen. We always have a theme. We kind of had a list of your books behind us, and then we had just the center of Amsterdam, the book that obviously I mentioned that I love so much. And we ended up with this because I think the Horseshoe, I don't know that many cities like that, if any, in the world. I can't compare it to anywhere else.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most frustrating cities to navigate. I don't know if I've ever felt like I'm senile in such a city as this.
It's true that because of the horseshoe, you think, oh, okay, I'll just get on the Herengracht and start walking, and I'll get there, and then you're going north, and then suddenly you're going south.
Yeah. Yeah, or the fact that you think that another street would theoretically be parallel, so you're walking and you're actually walking further away from the location you're trying to, because psychologically you think it's a parallel street. You just know it's the vein running out of the city.
I've lived here for years. Of course, I know how to get there. But yeah, it's funny.
And that's probably one of the Ronnie and I don't argue all that often, but she's now forced me to walk certain routes because she doesn't want me to add any steps onto our journey.
Any complications, yeah.
So we actually have to walk the center of Singelgracht, because she's explained to me over and over again, Andy, if you walk an outer ring, you're walking more steps to get to your end destination. So first go to Singelgracht, walk where you need to get to, and then drop out wherever you need to get out. So.
Wise.
These are the
physics.
These are the things you learn.
Yeah.
So I've got questions for you, and I'd love to start with, what brought you to Amsterdam to begin with?
Well, I wrote a book years ago called "The Island at the Center of the World."
Yeah.
In Dutch, it's called New Amsterdam, and it's about the Dutch founding of a colony in a city that, when the English took over, they renamed it New York. And at that time, I was living in New York, and I think I've learned as a writer that I always tend to gravitate toward origins. I want to know the origin story of whatever it is I'm talking about. And I was interested in New York's beginnings, and I knew what everybody knows, which is it was originally New Amsterdam, that there was a guy called Peter Stuyvesant, that he had a wooden leg. I just knew a few really basic things, and that was it. But then, and I talked to a number of friends, people I knew who were historians, including historians of New York, wanting more information. And each one of them kind of said, "Oh, the Dutch period, I don't go there. I don't know that," which just really intrigued me. And I kind of thought that must mean, well, there's nothing to go on. There's no records. But then somebody pointed me to, they said, you should talk to this guy in Albany, New York, named Charlie Gehring. And eventually I tracked him down, and he had been, and still is, since 1974, translating the archives of the colony of New Netherland. I remember very well, I had 3 remarkable phone conversations with him. And each one, it was like my understanding, not just of New York's beginnings, but of American history and how it all got started, was like being exploded, So that's eventually what I wrote a book about, not just New York's beginnings, but how that transforms your notion of what America is and how it got started. And while working on that, of course, I'm interested in the Dutch in the 17th century, the Gouden Eeuw, the Golden Age, and all that, which you're not supposed to say anymore. So I got to Amsterdam, and I was meeting historians there. And at a certain point, I thought, this is kind of the next step for me. This is the next stage. And I eventually, I originally spent a year there. And then somewhere in the course of that year, I was living on the Reguliersgracht, and this really groovy rented canal house. And I realized that I wanted to spend a longer period of time. And one of my friends, Tracy Metz, was on the board of the John Adams Institute. And she said, well, if you think you want to stay, we are going to need a director. And we would be willing to sponsor you for a visa and all that. Wow. So that kind of gave me legitimacy, which something I guess I always crave. So.
Yeah. Isn't it funny? Because even in the building, being the director of this building and the facility, all of a sudden it's like, wow, all of a sudden if I'm the director of a facility with activities, it somehow gives me some strange credibility.
Right. And speaking of the building, it's in the West India House. And people often think that the John Adams Institute is the West India House. That's the facility that you run. In fact, it's just a little tiny office in the building that's rented. but again, it just has this.
I always thought it was. It was only recently that I went to the door and knocked. And then I saw you kind of I had 3 people smoking in front of the door, waiting to get in their office space. It was, it was surprising. You said something that I didn't know. You're not supposed to refer to it as the golden age anymore. Where did that come from?
There was a debate a while ago in Amsterdam. The Amsterdam Museum, I guess, kicked it off, deciding that they are no longer going to refer to the golden age because it was an age for so many. It was, for most people, I guess it was an age of repression and colonialism. So they are going to just, I guess, call it the 17th century, just nothing, getting away from this kind of Eurocentric notion that, oh, look at all these wonderful things that happened then, as if because by doing so, you're sort of ignoring the rest of the other side of the coin.
Wow. So it sounds like we can transition right now into your hatred of Trump.
That's always right there.
Isn't it like one step away? I was going to say, it's kind of.
By the way, it's still morning in Maryland where I am. So I'm drinking iced coffee, which I always do in the summer.
Please. I've seen and I love your post because basically it's interesting because you see some people still have a day job and they try to maybe post a thing here or there to subtly say I'm at odds with a certain thing going on, but you have no, you have no, there's nothing that you're holding back. Let's put it that way, as far as I can say.
Hold back in this. I mean, if you're faced with pure outrage, you have to express it because it becomes normalized. And it's, I think for the past 4 years, I was kind of saying to myself and to whoever I was talking to, why are people not in the streets? The outrage is so off the charts. Why are people not in the streets? And then suddenly, one thing happens, this poor guy is killed by the cops. And that turns out to be the thing that does it, So you just never know it's so fascinating. Humans are like, I don't know, we're like ants or something. You just don't know what is going to cause, what is going to be the event that tips the scales, and then our sort of herd behavior finally kicks in. And that's
it's hard to protest him letting off one of his comrades. I mean, who's going to protest that? It's just not. It's not like when we choose to use the polar bear for the campaign of Greenpeace or something. We're all of a sudden emotionally we have. So you're right. What ignites the buildup?
Right. I mean, initially you had this huge women's marches. Right after Trump was in office. And it was like, okay, this is just going to continue. There's going to be marches and protests and it's going to get bigger and bigger. And then the fear was, oh no, it's just actually going to become normalized. People will get used to it because whatever, the stock market is okay or, but so many things I guess now are not okay. And it's visceral, it's really, people see it and feel it in ways they didn't before. And it's so fascinating how it has ignited and fed into the Black Lives Matter has been around for years, but now that kind of these two lanes merged. The 2 lanes of dissent, long-standing outrage have merged.
Yeah. Do you miss not being here during that time, or are you happy to sort of be at a historical moment in the U.S. right now?
Well, I miss not being in Amsterdam, period. And I'm in a small town. I live in a small town in Western Maryland in the mountains. So this is kind of a red corner of a blue state. So it's interesting in that I feel in a way that I'm actually in America, and like my friends in New York, they don't have people here have Trump signs on their lawns. That kind of thing, so I feel like I'm here, which is
you wouldn't have a Biden sign on your lawn or anything, I guess.
Well, I'm not against it. I don't believe on, I'm not big on signs. I guess.
No, me neither. Let's get that clear.
I'm wearing clothes that have brand logos on.
I didn't see you as a sign person. Let's also.
But on the other hand, though, this is a small town and people aren't marching down the streets in the same way they are in big cities. So, and people are neighborly, and that a lot of people around you might be Trump supporters, but it's interesting too, after having lived in cities for so long, to be in a small town, and there's a different vibe where people like in local government, we're all kind of, so many of us are like, for example, right down the street, this bridge has been out. Whatever our political affiliations, we all want the bridge to be open,
Yeah.
You have different kinds of alliances.
Yeah. There's a few questions in my mind all at once. I just want, as an aside, when I read the book, when I went to Amsterdam, I always use the wrong subheader, A History of the World's Most Liberal City. I always want to say the world's most liberal city, and I always screw that up. When I read it, there was, like I always mention, my sixth sense moment when I didn't understand how Calvinism permeated the Dutch culture. And it was very similar. I mentioned on a prior show, I studied the history, themes in American history in Australia. I went to Sydney University and studied American history there, which is kind of humorous. And the teacher showed Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He showed Rambo, and he showed maybe a third film. And he said, you only need to watch these 3 movies to understand America. And I was sitting.
Did you feel outraged at that?
I was pissed. I'm like, motherfucker, who are you to project that on me? Like, that was the feeling. And then years later, I said, this guy's a genius, because what he was doing was this, what he called at the time, the manifest destiny. The American believes there's always something further to be gotten or to be achieved. And that was the mentality that came over from the first settlers. So it all made sense. And then having read your book about the Calvinism sitting at the gates and holding back on the religious excesses of the Spanish, and then breaking through and saying, hey, we're throwing out this. I'm like, wow, this is what I've seen throughout my whole time living here.
Well, first of all, my wife's situation kind of echoes yours. She's an American, but she got her master's in American studies at the University of Amsterdam. Oh. And she was often sort of outraged at, this Dutch professor saying, oh, this is America, in kind of a snide way or something, And of course, there was some truth in what the person was saying. I mean, the city, I think religion is certainly a big factor in the development of Dutch culture, the Dutch mindset, even though, and the funny thing is that the Dutch have moved sort of past religion in some ways, at least for now. So it's not as clear on the surface as it may have been,
but they kind of say if we benefit financially and it doesn't hurt anybody else, then it's allowed. Gedogen, that's at least
that's one aspect of it. But also, I think they kind of willfully, consciously moved past religion at a certain period in the post-war period, so which is why you see churches converted to all these other purposes. But it is there, and it was there as part of the forming of a national culture. When you had these different provinces, they were separate under Spanish rule. And then when Spain tries to bring in the Inquisition and impose itself, they come together. So you see sort of nationalism and religion fuse in a way, but of course things are never as neat as that, because at the same time you still had Catholics and Protestants within the Netherlands, and so they were at odds with each other even while they're coming together to fight the Spanish. So
I thought it was curious that basically after the Spanish were tossed out, they always have that when you go to the red light district, there's always the little church where the Catholics could go.
Right.
Yeah. Where you couldn't say it was a service. You could only show up at the door, and then you were allowed, but no one spoke about it.
And that's gedogen. That's
the gedogen.
That's all right. Technically, it's not allowed, but as long as they don't, put a sign on the door saying this is a Catholic church, we'll be okay with it.
I think that's something that other cultures don't understand.
And strangely enough, that was kind of progress, because elsewhere they would burn you as a witch if you weren't following the state religion. So they were progressive.
Yeah, they were. For most definitely. There's a level of tolerance even after they've been, there was so much aggression towards them. I've always been impressed by that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, I've written about this, and then people say, oh, they weren't tolerant because they did all these restrictive things. But it's tolerance now. I mean, it doesn't mean celebrating diversity. It doesn't mean, oh, we love all people of all faiths. No. It means more like you're willing to put up with in say a 17th century context. Yeah. So you always have to try to look at it not through your own lenses, your own glasses, but in terms of in relation to what was going on at the time.
How does it feel for you? Because I mentioned this to you before and you sort of brushed it off as if it wasn't really something special. And I thought it was quite special that I see, and I've seen a lot of Dutch people that have read your book, and they only began to understand their culture and themselves through reading a book that you'd written. How does it feel to know that that's the case?
First of all, I mean, my earlier book about Dutch New York, which I just flew into, madly into the research and the writing, and only after it was written did my agent say, "Oh, the Dutch want to translate it. They want to have a Dutch edition." Uh-huh. And I said, "Oh my God, you mean Dutch people are going to come to me to read Dutch history?" I mean, had I known that at the time, I would have frozen. I wouldn't have. Wow. So that was a surprise. I never even thought that would happen. And then with this book, one of the great things about Dutch culture is that they are very willing and interested in what other people think of them and how other people look at them. And you might contrast that a bit with Americans who aren't so interested necessarily in.
You mean there's somebody else?
What's that?
I said, you mean there's somebody else?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's a great thing about the Dutch, that they want to know how are people looking at us, and therefore, and the other side of that is, as you well know, the Dutch are not great at kind of saying, and this again contrasts with Americans, to say, look how great we are. Look at all these wonderful things we did. So if somebody from the outside comes along and says, the Dutch actually did some very interesting things that have been very consequential, in some of them in very positive ways, they're happy to hear that. And maybe they will take that more readily from an outsider than from another Dutch person who, if they did that, they'd say, oh, they're being jingoistic and that kind of thing. Yeah. So I guess there was an opening, which I inadvertently exploited.
Well, I can tell you that on several occasions, I've had Dutch people come in and say that they had only learned and understood their own culture through reading that book. So that's an incredible praise for your work.
Great to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, and done in such a.
And of course, though any piece of writing you do, any book you do, it's like your best shot as of that time. So it's always very limited, and people lob criticism, and you go, yeah, that's probably true.
Actually, my next book comes out at the end of next month.
Congratulations!
Thank you. I did the voiceover for it, and as I was doing the voiceover, I was like, this sucks. Like, I'm so past this now. Like, I already know what I would have written or said different, so in some ways.
You mean you read the audiobook?
Yeah, I read the audiobook.
Yeah, that is a strange experience, because then you're really focused on every word that you wrote, and you're like, you're supposed to be just reading it dispassionately, but in your head you're thinking, oh my God, why did
I write it that way? I used the same word 3 sentences ago, and it sounds like I'm just not able to fabricate any other language.
So you're having this conversation with yourself in your head while you're supposed to be focused on the.
If I were Trump, it would be great, because I just repeat the same thing 3 times until everyone.
You would think it was all great no matter what. So.
You'll have to bring Trump in. Huh?
I do, because as far as I'm concerned, I don't mention Trump on 82 shows, but with you, I've welcomed the subject in.
That's fine.
Because there's
I greatly look forward to not talking about it. But
I would hope so. The thing that makes it also interesting is because it is the most liberal city in the world, and the word liberal is thrown around right now as the most negative thing one could be if you're with someone in the Trump camp.
Right.
And so the curiosity is like, what is it that you've seen in being in the U.S. that now makes this word so toxic?
I don't know that. I mean, I think the funny thing is, in the past, say, 20 years, people on the right got very good at turning that word into something pejorative. And I think that's kind of doesn't have the same effect anymore. I mean, maybe it does for, that 30% of Americans who are always, going to believe in elves and believe that the moon is made out of cheese. And, just that's Trump's core support, the real hardcore magical thinkers. And maybe that word still has that effect for them. But I think for the most part, people, I mean, now what's more interesting in the last election cycle was Bernie Sanders using the word socialist in a positive context, and Americans saying, "Yeah, fine, that's a good idea. Well, let's go with that."
But it's going to say anything that actually benefits the humans on a direct level is socialism, right? There's like,
right, and now you're starting to see them, people on the right, try to use that as a club. Yeah. To beat people with.
What I don't know?
I mean, the funny thing about that is liberal, of course, and the way I mostly mean it in the Amsterdam book, it has to do with freedom, a philosophy that promotes individual freedom. And that is the very thing that Trump supporters think they are supporting, is a philosophy of individual freedom. And they think anything that Democrats, that liberals are espousing impinges on that because it's regulating life.
Yeah.
It's overly regulating life. So there's a weird flip-flop going on there, because, I mean, by their own logic, they are the true liberals.
Yeah. Yeah, true. Yeah. Freedom, the ultimate freedom.
Yeah.
It started with the Tea Party movement, actually.
Yeah. Exactly.
I have been away from the U.S. for 30 years. So it's almost like I get to peek in and then leave again, peek in and leave in again. And there's a curious seeing it from that process, because it's almost like if you're a frog in water and the water's boiling, you don't realize it. But if you kind of put your foot in and out, you're like, wow, it got a lot hotter.
Yeah.
And what I've seen was that when Fox News first came out and there was this sort of very strong conservative voice in America, that then became really in my head like a propaganda machine, right? Just a propaganda machine. And in some ways, you also could see on the CNN side that someone could say, wow, that's just a propaganda machine for the other side, because no one's really trying. They're all appealing to an echo chamber at some point. And that's a kind of a curious and a weird thing to observe from an outside perspective, because my work is all on spiritual enlightenment. And there's nothing further away from spiritual enlightenment than identity.
Okay, right. That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah.
And so I'm always like, wow. So now you can identify with a religion or with anything, but now you've identified yourself as whatever, or conservative or liberal or however you want to label it. And I'm always stuck with like, oh my God, like there is no freedom in thinking of yourself as this, because then you're not going to be in dialogue. And that's the struggle I've at least encountered, is that there is no dialogue, because once you've identified yourself as something, then you have to defend it.
You're frozen. You're locked in.
You're frozen.
Yourself into a room. Yeah. Now that's a very nice way of. I mean, just by putting it in those terms, you're identifying that people are locking themselves into a room, but you're also saying, look, there's a door right there. You can open it and be free of all this, which is, you should. Is that what your book is about?
Yeah, of course. That's what my book is about. Basically, all I did was I had 20 stories of people that were attached to self-identity. And I said, I want you to say the thing you're most frightened to say and follow it with, it's fucking great. So whatever it is, I'm going to die. If I'm going to die and it's fucking great. I'm going to fail in my business and it's fucking great. Like for the perfectionist who can't get started, and on and on. So it was basically just embracing the fact that whatever you're resisting in yourself is defining you. So in the case of a liberal or a conservative, they're actually resisting the idea that they may be not them. I'm not that.
Right.
So you have to embrace some.
So then that's a great tool for you to promote the book, to go around America and say to conservatives, repeat after me, I'm a liberal.
Exactly.
I'm really a liberal.
I never thought of it in that terms.
I've been thinking about that way whole way. I mean, I've got a chapter in the book about politics where I wrote it 2 years ago, exactly about what's happening right now.
Wow.
And I said, if I come into a fight and I said, I'm on neither side because I see that, an eye for an eye and the world goes blind, but I'm going to ask you to join me in the middle ground. And I realized, wow, now I'm really, and I wrote in the book, I said, I don't know if I even want to write this because I know everyone's going to say I'm part of the problem.
That's great.
That's what I wrote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so do you have because I know before you do this very intensive on the ground, I guess, book promotion and meeting people. Are you going to be doing that when the book comes out?
No, well, with COVID, that went out. COVID came in and the tour went out. So basically,
but that was so what's your plan B?
Well, the plan B was Bambos and I sitting here on a daily basis and chit-chatting.
We're doing it right now.
We're doing 82 shows. I think you're the 82nd guest. And this has been...
What, you could just go out of the street and drag someone in?
I mean, that might be where we go afterwards. I kind of have been thinking concept days. I haven't told you about this, but randomly going up to people and ask them to tell us the stories and things like that would just be more engaging. But yeah, that's kind of been it. And I've got a publicist, I've got the press release. I talked to the publicist that you mentioned, but then because of everything went out the door, I also didn't follow that up. So, but it's been exciting. I think what happens, I'm not one to ever say, what am I going to do now? It's more like, what can I do now? So I really took COVID as this beautiful moment and said, this is incredible. Like, what do I want to, I think I read that like certain theories of science were discovered at the last time there was a pandemic in the 1918. I don't know who it was. It was some scientist that actually sat down in a log cabin and basically wrote out some scientific understanding that wasn't understood before then. And it happened because of the pandemic then. And so I'm thinking, why wouldn't I not do whatever that guy did then and just make something totally new and enjoy it?
So you're seeing the opportunity in it.
Yeah, seeing the opportunity.
Yeah, I think I've talked to a lot of people who feel, sort of calmer because you don't feel the pressure to run all around and do all these things that you're normally doing. And I think I mostly feel that way, or at least partly feel that way. Because as a writer, you can just sit in your room anyway and write. I mean, the challenge is all this work that I had lined up, which involved all this travel, is suddenly gone. So all this income is gone. So what are you going to do? But I think I've tried to adopt a little bit of your sensibility of, okay, just be here now, just figure this out from here and figure yourself out from here. And the upside is I can, for the most part, do what I do here. I'm just going to have to rewrite the plan for this year or for the foreseeable future.
But you're writing a new book now.
I have a new book that I'm done with, and it's now in the stage of, we've got the cover design and and it's in copy edit and all that stuff. So
is there a title that's really announced, or is the title announced, or is that all?
Yeah, it's called Small Time, and it's about I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania, Johnstown, and back in the day it was this very vigorous little steel town. It was the first steel town in America, and then Pittsburgh took over from it. My grandfather and his brother-in-law ran the mafia there together in like the mid 20th century. So I grew up knowing that my grandfather was this small town mob guy. And by then he was really ostracized by the whole family. So I also grew up kind of internalizing, we don't talk about it, we don't think about that, And then a few years ago, everybody in my family kind of did the same thing in the immediate family. But a few years ago, somebody who was kind of a little bit more distant. He was my mother's cousin. He had lived outside of town he was a jazz musician. He spent his whole career in Las Vegas. He retired and he came back home, and it was Christmas break and I was home for Christmas. And we went down to this club to see him. And in the break between the sets, he said to me, hey, Russell, you're a writer. What are we going to do about the story? And I said, what story? And he said, your grandfather, the mob. And everybody around me, all my relatives, because they internalized this, we don't talk about that, they all kind of cringed. And I did too. But since he had left, and I didn't know at the time, but as a teenager, he had worked for my grandfather as a bookie and a numbers runner, and so he just saw these as golden memories. And he kind of popped this bubble, with me, and I was like, he's right. I write history, and this is history, and it's my and part of that is the story of the small town mob in America, which was from Schenectady to Scranton to Fresno and Amarillo and all these little towns all over. It was there.
I was just watching The Irishman before I came to do this.
Yeah.
The second time, it's incredible.
Yeah. So it's this story. It has this historic backdrop, the small town mob, but it's also something very different for me in that it's this very personal story. And in fact, I was named after my grandfather. So I'm like looking for my namesake and trying to understand that world and who he was.
But I mean, is it written as a nonfiction, or is it written?
Nonfiction. Yeah, it's kind of, but it's sort of a combination of history and memoir, family memoir. Because what I do is I take my dad with me. My dad was his oldest son. And we together go looking for his father. And my dad would say things like, I never knew him. He always, what did he say? He always, he never broke character. That's what my dad.
Oh, really?
So my dad was like trying to understand, this guy who he had long since just said, all right, that's what it was. And, I'll just, what people do with pieces of their life, you just wrap it in.
But what a powerful thing to say. He never broke character.
Yeah, exactly. About your own father,
About your own father. I mean, you think about it.
What is the one in one sense, the book is the mob, and they had this pool hall that was their base of operations, and they ran the numbers out of the office upstairs. But the other level is that it's me and my dad trying to understand where we came from.
That's beautiful. I mean, I know how you write, so I can imagine you're interweaving in these interpersonal stories into a bigger narrative, which is
exactly.
Which makes it very accessible,
Yeah. So it's something a little definitely different for me, because what I try to do is, even if it's something like the city of Amsterdam, I try to get personal, inject some personal feeling into it, because that's what I think helps to engage a reader, and that's what makes it meaningful for you as the writer. But this is more obviously personal.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, like the story, of course, the story with, in the book, when you write about Jan and his father, Jan, the two Jans, talking about the frames and how Jan was very determined that it had to have the darker and Dad was the golden and so on. But it was sort of funny because in that way, through the narrative, I got a deep sense. And I also know Jan well enough that he's talked about frames so many damn times. It's in his DNA. It's just who he is, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, just in any kind of history, I loved zooming in on a story, a little tiny detail of a story like that, an anecdote almost, that is a way to unpack so much. I mean, all the history. I mean, Jan 6, he's the 11th Jan 6, and his son is the 12th. And the first one was Rembrandt's pal. And so that in itself there's so much history woven into that. And then just telling a little story, which Jan, of course, told me, that's how I knew it, of his struggle with his father, Jan 6, the 10th, and over this matter of what kind of frames to put around these great old paintings. And that gets at this struggle, this generational struggle between the two Jan 6s over their inheritance, and also style. And what's interesting about that too is the Jan who's our mutual friend, the younger Jan, wants the black frames because that's more that's what Rembrandt wanted. That was period. That was more authentic. But his father had a perfectly legitimate case too, because the gold frames were what their later ancestors put on the paintings. And to him, it was the collection as it was built up by their ancestors. that was the more authentic thing, to keep that. So that was a very interesting struggle between
Actually, we won't call it. We'll just call them 11 and 10. So we won't even call him by name anymore.
right.
You know what? He screwed with my brain because Jan 11, right? He forced me to look at paintings in the context in which they were made, which means that when they're flushed with light, you don't get to see the intention when Rembrandt painted it. Yeah. And what fascinated the hell out of me, where I'll see it sometimes, is when they dimly lit a Rembrandt painting so that the dark is so much more dark that you actually see what Rembrandt painted at that time.
Yeah,
People don't realize that.
He did that with me in his atelier on the Herengracht. We turned off the lights and he lit candles.
Yes.
And he said, this is the way they were meant. They were painted to be viewed by candlelight.
Yeah.
And then the mystery and the, things that are glimmering in the painting and,
that comes alive in a way that you never get to see when you're at this this white wash. Yeah. Beautiful.
But Jan is one of those great people who can tell you stories within stories, but do it. I mean, he's reading a painting to you. It's almost like it's a book and he's reading it to you and you're just, I thought I saw the painting, but now I'm seeing all these stories unfold.
Yeah, it was interesting because he, when we were talking and he discovered the Rembrandt, like he knew it was a Rembrandt through instinct as much as anything because he looked at Rembrandt his whole life. It was hanging in the house.
Yeah. And, while the funny thing is, while we're having this conversation, I just got an email about Jan 6 painting selling. Did you get this?
The new one or the?
So I'm wondering if that's what it is. Did the painting just sell? Did he sell it?
It was up for sale, I know, and I don't know if it finally sold, but it may have.
Yeah, here it is. Small Rembrandt self-portrait. Oh, self-portrait.
Self-portrait. No, it wasn't a self-portrait.
That's a different painting.
I mean, you're still like, whenever Jan, has anything exciting in his life, you're the one who gets to pull the story and put it in the New York Times. So
once.
Well, I mean,
when he had the first, there's 2 Rembrandts now that he has discovered apparently, and the first one that came to light as soon as I saw the news of that, I called him and said, "Congratulations!" And as we were talking, I said, "Can I write about this?" And so he said yes. So then, it was over the course of months that I worked on that with him, and then in the course of that, he told me, and then he told the world that there was this other Rembrandt he discovered. So it became this very complicated for me in a good way, for him in a very complex way. Very complicated story.
He's got the Dutch thing of not wanting to step in the limelight too much, but he's sort of weaning himself off that with his new film that he has and so on.
Right. Yeah.
There was something I wanted to. We touched on it once, and I want to go back to it. And it's something that I've seen in the Netherlands. I've also seen it in Australia when I lived there. There's different terms for it, but here I can't remember what it's called here, but I'll tell you what it's called in Australia, and I'm sure you'll know the Dutch term, where they say it's called cutting the tall poppy. So if one self-aggrandizes or elevates themselves on any level in Australia, they get shredded. They're just cut down. And the similar is true for the Dutch.
Yeah.
And I forget the term. Do you remember what
it is?
There
are several expressions in Dutch. One is the tallest trees catch the most wind, and the other is if the nail is too high, then it gets pounded down.
Yeah,
so the same notion. And the Americans don't have that problem at all.
No, and I find that fascinating because what I found is, say for instance, when I wrote my book and I put it out, I had friends that from high school and grade school, I haven't spoken to in 30 years. They bought the book. They showed their gratitude. They were so supportive, elevating, supporting. Here I might have a friend I see every week. He didn't even say, "Oh, you got a book, great." And I find that this way of sort of diminishing yourself, and it's like a limiter that you put onto your capacity to really expand and grow.
Yeah,
on a lot of levels.
It's an interesting dynamic that's part of the culture. And For example, that when my book about Dutch New York came out, one of the reviews in I think it was in The Guardian, it was one of the English newspapers, he began the review by saying, the most Dutch thing about the Dutch contribution to world history is how little you notice it. And it's because like the Dutch, they prefer to kind of slip under the radar,
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, so a foreigner here is highlighting it because the Dutch people don't tend to do that themselves.
I mean, they kind of got away with slavery if you look at it, because they were the ones that were basically making a big chunk of change on all the exchanges. Yeah. And they could kind of wipe their hands clean of it.
Right. Well, I mean, there are those kinds of reasons, I think, are built into that too, into that mentality of let's just quietly go about our business. Yeah. But it's a complicated and it's hard for Americans to kind of grasp that. You just automatically want to, wave your flag and say, "Hey, everybody, look at me."
Yeah, exactly.
That's how you're brought up. Yeah.
I've been fascinated because in the walks, Ronnie and I always joke, Ronnie takes me out for a walk every day because that's kind of the exercise I need to get. Yeah. And when I'm walking, of course, I'm always looking in the windows, and the windows are always open, usually without curtains and so on. Right. But what dawned on me was that as I'm walking the Gracht and looking at homes, which are $3-4 million, maybe more, and when you look inside, a lot of times you see that there's like the decoration is kind of what I would have thrown on the wall maybe when I was in high school. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Like, and I think to myself, isn't it fascinating that you spend so much money on a location and on this space, and then in America, I would think in the same context of if someone had that much money and they bought a house like this, it would be decked out.
Yeah.
And
well,
here,
a lot of places are decked out there,
I mean, not that they're not, but there's enough that are contrary to that it's kind of doesn't. My brain can't quite make sense of that.
Yeah. You're putting all this. Because obviously someone cares a great deal about things like, I mean, the very fact that they're say within the central Amsterdam in the Canal District, then they care a great deal about gezelligheid.
Yeah.
But where is it in the furnishings? Yeah.
No.
Often it's maybe they spend so much getting the place that they don't have anything left to furnish it with.
Yeah. Yeah, but I guess you haven't had the same experience, or have you noticed that, or is that just something I'm noticing?
I have, but I've also there are also places that are very. I mean, very I think there's always in Dutch culture historically a you don't want to be overly ostentatious. You don't want to flaunt it. You don't want to flaunt your wealth, and so maybe you have this. I mean, even a fairly grand canal house is not a chateau. I mean, it's not a castle.
No.
So,
it's 6 meters wide.
by definition, they're fairly modest places, and that which fits the.
So Bola Lang, who's our dear friend from South Africa who watches daily, he's commenting on our comment of the Americans' ability to self-aggrandize. Mm-hmm. And he's saying, is that the president of the U.S. is that why the president is always talking about it?
Yeah. I think he's an extreme example of that American tendency to, Americans are kind of raised to step up and to speak out and to promote themselves. And he is an extreme example of that, because I think most parents might have that, want to encourage their child to go forward and just stand in front of the class and speak. But there would be something in there in the parent to foster into the child the notion of
humility.
A little bit of like put it in perspective. Maybe there are people here who know more than you about the subject, and in this case, that it's it would be fascinating if it didn't have such terrible consequences. What would happen if you erased that other half? That like, let's put a check on things. Let's be let's be a little bit humble. Let's assume that other people might know better than you on certain matters. And we're really seeing that play out in this global world historic way. Yeah. What happens when a so-called leader just lacks that utterly. And when people, and that in itself would be one thing, but people let the person get away with that and say, oh no, he is
enablers.
He is yeah. I mean, you have a culture of enablers, and then everyone else is dragged along down this horrid road.
It was a fascinating study. I mentioned it before on a show, and it blew me away. But I know you probably know the one that I mentioned some time ago, where basically grade school kids were tested on their scores in math, arithmetic, math, science, and I think their local language. Three different things, 3 different courses they were taking, and they did it over several countries. And the Americans had the highest, so they self-decided how well they performed against their actual performance. And the Americans, by leaps and bounds, as children, said our performance were great, where their actual scores were lower. And the Asian countries scored great, but their perception of their scores was far lower.
Right. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And there's that thing, the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah,
which,
Dunning-Kruger.
you have to have a certain level of intelligence to be aware, oh, I'm not so smart. And otherwise, you could just blissfully think you're the king of the world.
Wow. Yeah, the more you know you don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
So Bambos and I, we have different roles on a show. Since you're an author and I like to dig into meaty concept thinking and talks, then I ask a lot of questions that are more literal and more about that. Bambos likes to ask the more emotional questions. And I haven't given him any time. We've got 9 minutes. I'd love to see if there's something that's been coming up for you.
I normally have a signal. I tap him on the leg.
He never tapped it. I'm waiting for him to tap me on the leg, like, Andy, let me in. I'm like, he's not tapping. What's going on here?
No, I really enjoyed your book. Like, I like as I'm reading it, especially the beginning, I'm like, oh, he actually lived in Holland. And you were talking about taking your daughter on the bike.
Son,
Your son, yeah. So, like, did you know you were going to write a book?
I originally came because I was working on the earlier book, and soon after I was there, it occurred to me that when I realized I was going to stay longer, it just seemed natural to me to write a book about Amsterdam, to try to understand the city better and understand my own fascination with it. And then in the beginning of the book, what I eventually did is, I mean, the book, as you read it, it's mostly a history of the city, but I didn't want it to be a standard history that, the city began in the year 1202 or whatever. I wanted to and I've done this in different ways with other books. Just in the beginning, what I do is I was living just 1 block from the Concertgebouw in Zuid. And so I started by starting my day. My day was, at that time, my son is now 10. At that time, he was a toddler, and I would get on my bicycle, strap him into the seat in front, and cycle through the neighborhood, taking him to his daycare where he would spend the day. And while I'm doing that, I'm taking you through that part of Amsterdam and the history of it. And then I fade away in the book. But in doing that, the technique, that I had in mind was making it personal. You, the reader, are with me as we're going to discover this together. So that's what I was trying to do.
It almost felt like you had one of those nice pens, like not your laptop, but a pen and just writing. Like that feeling I had.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
I can't think of Amsterdam starting without thinking of the puking out the wafer from the religious ceremony that came out of the face of Jesus. Every time I walk by that horrible building where they have the dungeon of Amsterdam, that's the story of how people used to come as a relic to see it.
Yeah. And that was like, what a perfectly Amsterdam related. Here is our great religious myth. It's about a guy puking.
A guy puking up a piece of bread that looked like Jesus's face.
Let's have a pilgrimage. Let's all go see it.
I didn't tell you, but we have an interesting show coming on. I used to take care of an old woman that lived across the street at a restaurant I was managing for a few years while I lived here. And she actually worked as a spy, where she would pull the journal. No, it's not actually. It's that you haven't got. It's not a good one. She would actually come on to the soldiers, they'd take the soldiers away and then they'd shoot them. So she worked as I don't know what the word would be, but like a honey magnet of something. And I lived in Vienna for 10 years. So when I try to speak Dutch, German words would filter in because the languages are so close. And every time the word came in, she'd cringe because she had such a visceral reaction to living at that time.
Wow.
She even had a bullet that came into her window and she refused to get the window changed because it was always a reminder that the Germans were around.
Yeah.
And by the way, just that you know, you're not here, but like we haven't had this many Germans in Amsterdam since World War II, because they have descended on.
Oh,
the
really?
city.
That's interesting. So because it's they've determined that it's a relatively safe place to travel to.
Relatively safe, no mask, it's close, and you want to get out of Germany. Where do you go? We can drive to Amsterdam.
Interesting.
So the whole city, I swear to you, it's like you would not know that you're in the Netherlands because German is being spoken everywhere. I went to a restaurant 2 nights ago. There were 4 couples, and they were all German.
Wow.
So outside of Ronnie and I.
And this is happening over the past month or so, I guess.
After the past month. We opened up since the doors open,
Yeah.
It's quite fascinating.
Wow. Very interesting.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting story too about your neighbor, the woman with the bullet through the window.
Yeah,
puts me in mind of the building that was the headquarters of the Luftwaffe on the De Basel, the building on the Weiselstraat. That was the Germans made the headquarters of the Luftwaffe. It was the ABN AMRO Bank, and when they came in, they wanted everybody out, and the German officer said, and I guess the director of the bank, they were in his office, the German officer said, we want everybody out by, I think, 1 o'clock. And they were dragging their feet a little bit. And so he shot a hole at the 1 o'clock on the clock, and that's still there. And if you go to the director's office of the bank, the clock still has a hole in it.
Oh, wow. That is fascinating. That's the building where Apple is next to it, right? That's that area of the city is
on the Weiselstraat, between the Keizersgracht and the Prinsengracht.
Because they're shutting down all.
And the Prinsengracht, yeah.
Like wherever there used to be a bank, they're like not.
It was the ABN AMRO, yeah.
Say ING like shut down all their banks now. So like there's like 3 banks you can walk into in Amsterdam now because they shut down. Like it's like they're culling all these banks. Wherever you say there's a bank there, there was once a bank there.
Yeah, that's so interesting how this is transforming the look of places too, and what the long-term effects of all this is going to be. I keep thinking of periodically there's a forest fire and everything burns down, and then so you think, okay, it's dead, it's a dead zone, but then new shoots come up. So we're going to then see what these new shoots are in cities all over the world.
Yeah, we on the street we're on, 25% of the actual stores shut down already.
Wow.
So there's 20 stores. So we're saying maybe like 25% shut down pretty quick after COVID came. So,
right.
Yeah, definitely. 9 streets is certainly taking a whole nother shift in what it's going to be doing in the future for sure. Right.
It's going to be 7 streets.
Exactly. 7 sustainable streets.
Yeah, crazy.
Yeah,
I can't wait to get back and just see, the aftermath, what the city's like, and because of course it's going to, as I say, the forest will regrow. It's going to come back.
I loved it. It was some of the nicest time I've ever spent in the city. It was the first time I felt like it was a village again. I've lost perspective. When I go into a hotel and there's a world clock and Amsterdam is one of the clocks, I'm like, who are they kidding? It's 800,000 people. You go to London, you got 8 million tenfold, and you're like, they're on the same clock as if Amsterdam is.
Their clock should be tiny. It should be.
But when everyone left and you walk the streets alone, and I mean, the red light district was empty. I mean, empty, like no one empty. It was freaky because it was such a beautiful space. I've never thought the red light district was beautiful because I'm always, stepping over someone's puke. Yeah. So, but it was really fascinating to enjoy that part of the city.
Yeah, I've had a few people over the past few months have, just walked with their phone, with their, made a video or bicycled and sent it to me, and it's just, It's a different. It's like it's a private city. You know, it's all yours.
Yeah.
I guess it's a little different now than it was.
It is. We're back to where we're back to where we were, and it's going to come back again because with people not concerned, it'll be we'll have the second wave for sure. But they're trying to make a little bit of money in between.
Right. Yeah. We're still in the first wave here.
Yeah. Well, we reached our hour, so thank you. I'm really grateful.
Lovely. It's wonderful. It's wonderful chaos.
Yes. We try not to prepare too many questions ahead because God forbid we'd actually know what we're going to say.
And then we'd know what we were talking about. So.
Yes. And then we can't bring in random subjects that bring us down rabbit holes.
Right. Well,
thank you.
Great. Thank you both.
Yeah.
Real pleasure.
Yeah. All the best.
Yep.
Yeah. That was fun.
Yeah.
I know you've got to go. You've got an authentic relating activity going on very soon.
I'm going to go be authentic with a few people.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know, Bambos is always offering authentic relating courses, and he does that. And if people want to sign up for a course, where would they sign up?
This evening it's online. And where do they sign up? They don't. They
go to Authentic Relating Amsterdam, and I think contact you, I would think, no?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Not for today, though.
No, not for today. I mean, in the future going forward. If you're feeling like you're disconnected and you'd like some intimacy in your life, this is an opportunity to find that.
Yeah. Definitely.
So please check it out. And I don't even know who we have on tomorrow. Do you know who we have on tomorrow? I don't have my list with me, do I? Oh, maybe I do. Okay, we have something here. Tomorrow.
Oh, yeah, the storyteller.
We got Sahand on. That's cool. Sahand is a storyteller. He's a real storyteller. He travels the world and tells stories. He's done several plays, and he has an entire facility only geared towards telling stories. So we have him tomorrow on for the hour. And it was great to be with you on a wonderful chaos. See you tomorrow. Bye.